When a brutal snowstorm sweeps through a forgotten small town, a man quietly steps out of the shadows of his past to save a life. Unaware that this single act will reignite his name, revive an entire community, and forever alter the fate of those who believed the world had left them behind. The cold in Pine Hollow wasn't like the snowstorms in New York or other big cities. It was quieter, longer lasting, and seeped into your bones with the persistence of an unnamed sorrow. No car horns, no voices, just wind, howling through rotted wood slats and across sagging rooftops, like it was testing the patience of every soul left in town. On the dampest row of homes in the poorest part of town, Dr. Elijah Brooks was crouched on a roof, wrestling with a sheet of metal siding that had come loose. Every strike of his hammer felt like he was nailing down an old memory. Every crack he patched wasn't just damage to the roof, it was something broken inside his own heart. A tall black man with broad shoulders and eyes that always seemed heavy with something unsaid, though no one ever dared to ask. He wore frayed work gloves, a stretched and faded knit cap, but his face still held that unmistakable air of someone who'd once stood between life and death. The cold wind bit into his skin, but Elijah didn't seem to feel it anymore. He'd grown used to the cold, not just the weather, but the chill of suspicion, the half-spoken words, the silence that screamed louder than accusation. Inside the small house, his daughter Amara sat by the fire reading a book. She was 10 with mild asthma. Her occasional cough cut through the quiet and twisted something deep inside Elijah. He knew he couldn't let the roof leak in the middle of winter. Every move he made wasn't just repair, it was defense. Defense against worse things that could come. He was holding his world together with nails, metal, and one painfully simple reason: to protect his daughter. Elijah used to be the head of surgery at a prestigious city hospital, calm, precise, respected and beloved by both patients and peers. He had it all: career, reputation, a future wide open, until it all came crashing down. A murky incident. A powerful patient died on the table. No one wanted to face the truth, and Elijah, a brilliant black man, made the perfect scapegoat. His license was suspended, the press tore him apart, and in the blink of an eye, the world turned its back. No one asked for his side, no one gave him a chance to explain. He walked away. Not out of fear, but to shield his daughter from the spotlight, from the cruel whispers. Pine Hollow became his refuge. A tiny town that didn't care about who he was, only whether he could treat wounds and write prescriptions. He lived quietly, frugally, without complaint, but every morning he woke to the same burden: the silence of justice never served. That morning, the sky was a dull gray, like a warning written across the heavens. Snow fell heavier, and as Elijah bent down to drive in the final nail, his eyes caught a flicker of movement at the far end of the street. A small figure swaying, lost in a sea of white. A child. No hat, no gloves, coat hanging open, stumbling through ankle-deep snow. Elijah didn't feel fear or surprise, just a deep, gut-wrenching ache. Another child left out in this cold? He dropped the hammer and stood. His heart began to pound, not from the cold, but from a sense that something was shifting this morning. Something big. He climbed down from the roof faster than usual, the hammer still loose in his hand. Snow fell in thick sheets and the wind clawed at him with invisible fingers. The child, a small boy, shaking, was trudging through the snow, with every step a struggle. Elijah rushed forward, dropped to his knees, and reached out without hesitation. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and warm, though his heart was racing. The boy looked up, eyes red from cold and crying. "My mom, she hit a tree. She won't wake up." Elijah didn't pause for even a second. He scooped the boy into his arms. The kid's breath was thin, shallow. He sprinted toward the house, shouldering the door open. Wind screamed in behind them like a mournful cry. "Amara!" he called. His daughter peeked around the kitchen door. Make some cocoa. Grab more blankets. We've got a guest. Elijah laid the boy on the old sofa. He wrapped him in a thick blanket, his hand pressing against a cheek cold as stone. The boy shook, but slowly. His breathing calmed under the warmth of the fire. "What's your name?" Elijah asked, offering a mug of cocoa. "Tyler," the boy whispered. "I was with Mom. Then, another car she was driving, fast, lost control, hit a tree. She hasn't woken up." Elijah nodded, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You did great, Tyler. That was really brave. Now let me go find your mom, okay? You stay here and keep warm." Tyler grabbed his arm, eyes flaring with fear. Don't leave me, I'm scared." Elijah leaned down, locking eyes with him. Calm but firm. "I promise. I'll be back. But your mom's out there waiting." "And we don't let anyone wait in a storm like this, right?" The boy nodded slowly. Elijah stood, moved to the coat rack by the door. He threw on a thick jacket, pulled on gloves, and opened the wooden cabinet where he kept the first aid kit. An old, red box, worn but always ready. He glanced back at Amara, who sat quietly, her expression wiser than her years. She didn't say a word, just gave a small, knowing nod. "Watch over him for me," Elijah said. "If anything changes, call 911. "Yes, Dad," Amara replied. Before leaving, Elijah scribbled a few lines on a small slip of paper and placed it beside the phone. "If I don't make it back in time, call Mr. Ray at number 6. I believe in you." That quiet note felt less like a reminder and more like an unspoken goodbye. He turned back toward Tyler. The boy's eyes clung to that promise like a lifeline. Elijah placed a hand on his chest, where his heart still beat steady, a rhythm like a guiding drum. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a father's journey. A man once abandoned by the world, now rising for the life of someone else. The door burst open. Wind crashed in. Elijah stepped out, and behind him the small house with 2 trembling children still held a warm glow from the fire. Proof that even in a blizzard there's still a place, still a person who refuses to turn their back on hope. The storm raged like it had a score to settle with the world. Elijah hunched forward as he walked, the wind lashing his face until he had to stop just to breathe. Snow piled up past his knees, covering everything in blinding white. Trees, fences, familiar roads, all swallowed under the storm's silver wrath. He didn't walk by sight, but by memory. Autumn walks, Amara's laughter as she chased falling leaves. Those were his guideposts now. His fingers clenched the handle of the first aid kit, the metal strap freezing against his skin. In his mind, he saw the woman, Tyler's mother, slumped over the steering wheel, her eyes closed, a thin ribbon of blood tracing down her temple. He didn't know her name, but the way Tyler said Mom made it impossible not to picture Amara in her place, alone, out there. Every few minutes, Elijah stopped, exhaled clouds of white breath, and checked his direction. The snow was thick enough to erase tracks in moments. The wind howled like it was mourning, curling into his spine with ghost-like fingers. But still he pushed forward, slowly, steadily, each step a quiet act of redemption. Then, in a rare lull between gusts, he heard it. Metal striking metal, a sound out of place in the frozen woods. His chest tightened. He turned toward the sound, pushing past bare-branched shrubs. And then he saw it, a black SUV half buried in snow like a blot of ink on a blank page. Its front end crushed into a pine tree, the hood crumpled, windshield shattered. Elijah broke into a run, hands digging through the snow until they found the door handle. "Can you hear me?" he shouted. No answer, just the shrieking wind. The door was jammed. He stepped back and kicked, once, twice. Finally, the steel frame gave with a loud crack, and the door swung open, revealing a woman slumped unconscious. Dried blood streaked across her face. Elijah's heart pounded, but his hands remained steady. Pulse. Yes. Breathing, faint, a gash on her forehead, But the real danger was the cold. Her body was already shutting down. He pulled gauze from the kit, wiped away the blood, then stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her. She needed heat, and she needed it now. Lifting her from the seat, Elijah stepped out into the wind again. Her weight grew heavier with every stride, not from her body, but from the sinking snow and the relentless force of the storm. Wind whipped at his face like thousands of icy lashes. He grit his teeth and kept going. Each footstep was a battle. He couldn't feel his knees anymore. His shoulders ached. His breath came in ragged gasps, lungs tightening in the freeze. On the way back, there were moments Elijah thought he wouldn't get up again. Once, he slipped, hard, knee slamming into the ice. He groaned aloud but didn't stay down. In his mind, he heard his daughter's voice from nights when he told her bedtime stories. "You always come back, right, Dad?" He clenched his fists, braced his back, and rose. Whenever he felt like stopping, he pictured Tyler, his tiny hands wrapped around the mug of cocoa, those wide eyes full of fragile hope. Elijah couldn't return alone. This wasn't just duty anymore, it was a promise made by a man, a father, someone the world had cast aside, now piecing trust back together with his bare hands. Then, through the white chaos, he saw it. A light, porch light of his home, faint, blurred, but real, like a flame that refused to die in the darkness. Drawing on strength from somewhere deep, Elijah pressed forward. At last, his roof emerged from the snow, hazy like a ship in a white sea. He pushed himself to move faster. Near the porch, his leg buckled, but he didn't fall. He dropped to one knee, adjusted his grip, and stood again. He wouldn't collapse now. He slammed into the door with his back. Wind screamed one last time before being shut out. Amara and Tyler ran to him. Elijah dropped to the floor, gently laying the woman onto the bench near the fireplace. "Amara, get warm water. Tyler, sit with your mom. Hold her hand." He went to work, carefully, precise, like he was back in an operating room. The bleeding stopped. Her body temperature began to rise. Elijah wrapped her in blankets, placed warm compresses near her sides. She didn't wake, but her breathing steadied. He collapsed onto the floor beside the wall, chest heaving. Tyler sat beside his mom, his small hands clutching hers, eyes locked on her face. Amara sat next to her father, quietly handing him a cup of hot tea she had prepared while waiting. Elijah took it, but didn't drink. His eyes stayed on the woman still unconscious, and for that moment he thought of nothing else. Not the snow, not the storm, not the past. This life, fragile, but returning. No one spoke for a while. Only the crackling fire, the mother's shallow breaths, and the wind outside howling in vain. Elijah closed his eyes, silently grateful he had made it in time. Then he whispered, not sure if it was to Tyler, Amara, the woman, or maybe to himself, "She's gonna be okay, I promise." Time moved slowly inside the small house, as if each minute were stretched out by the fragile rhythm of shallow breaths. Elijah barely took his eyes off the woman, his hand occasionally resting on her wrist to check her pulse. Every beat of her heart was a quiet reminder. Life was still here, still holding on, however faintly. The fire burned steadily, casting a soft golden glow. Tyler had fallen asleep beside his mother, his head resting on her shoulder like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Amara sat across the room, flipping through an old medical textbook, pretending to read, though she kept sneaking glances at her father. Elijah looked at his daughter and gave a faint smile. "You did good," he whispered. "You are so brave." Amara didn't respond, just scooted closer and placed her small hand on his shoulder. A quiet gesture, but from it Elijah felt warmth spread through him, a gentle strength that carried him through countless long, lonely nights. Just before dawn, the woman began to stir. A soft groan, a flicker of movement in her fingers. Elijah leaned in, instantly checking her pupils, retaking her pulse. Signs of improvement. Tyler woke up at the same time, eyes still heavy with sleep, but glowing with hope. "Man," her dry lips barely moved, trembling with effort. Elijah lifted her gently and brought water to her mouth. And then, through the haze, her eyes finally found her son's face, and the first tear rolled down her cheek. It came out in a rasp, barely more than a breath. Tyler nodded over and over, wrapping his arms around her. Elijah stood and quietly stepped back, giving mother and son their moment. Mara began tidying up the blankets, helping the woman sit up a little more comfortably. After a while, as morning light crept through the slats of the window, the woman turned to Elijah. Her gaze clearer now, she studied him, her brows slowly drawing together. Then, as if a distant memory had just found its way back, she spoke. "You're Elijah Brooks." He nodded, calm but guarded. "That's right." Silence hung between them for a moment. Then she said, voice still hoarse but precise, "I remember you. You used to work at St. James. I have a cousin. She's an assistant medical director there. She told me about what happened." The sentence trailed off, like a wound reopened. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He turned away, eyes fixed on the fire like he was searching for cover in its glow. Finally he spoke, voice low and steady. "They needed someone to blame, and I was just convenient enough to be that someone." She didn't speak, not out of suspicion, but thought. Her eyes weren't wary anymore. They'd shifted to something more contemplative, like she was re-examining an entire chapter of truth she'd once believed without question. "You didn't have to save me," she said at last, "especially knowing I might have believed the worst about you." Elijah shook his head. "All I saw was someone hurt, and I took an oath to help, no matter what." She turned to look at her son, then back at Elijah. Her lips pressed together like she wanted to say something but wasn't ready. In the end, she simply said, "I'm Jasmine Whitehead." Elijah froze. That name. He'd heard it before, and it changed everything. But he didn't ask. He just nodded and replied softly, "It's good to meet you, Jasmine, even under these circumstances." They sat there, 3 adults, 2 children, in a small, humble room, but in that moment it felt like an emergency ward at the center of life's storm. And between them something had just been born, a thin but undeniable thread of trust. Outside, the blizzard had begun to fade. The snow no longer fell heavy. The wind had softened, making way for the first pale light of a new day. It lit their faces, still marked with exhaustion, but in their eyes there was something else now. Elijah closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let himself feel just a little lighter. The story wasn't over, but something was changing. 3 days had passed since the night of the storm, yet its echoes lingered in every brick, every drop of melting water on the windowsill. The snow had begun to thaw, revealing narrow, winding paths through town. Pine Hollow was returning to its old rhythm, quiet, humble, but inside Elijah's small home nothing felt the same. Jasmine was strong enough now to move slowly around the room, and Tyler rarely let go of her hand for more than a moment. Every morning she sat in silence for hours, hands wrapped around the cup of hot tea Elijah made her, eyes drifting toward the window, as if she were looking for something bigger than snow, bigger than the town itself. She didn't say much, but it was clear she was preparing for something important, a decision that once made couldn't be stopped. Elijah didn't pry. He'd always been a quiet man, but he knew that look. It was the look of someone who had once believed in the wrong story and was now wrestling with the truth to set it right. That afternoon, Jasmine asked Elijah if she could use a corner of the desk. She pulled out her laptop, connected to the weak cellular signal, and opened dozens of browser tabs. As Elijah passed by, he caught sight of names on her screen. Familiar ones. St. James Hospital, State Medical Board. Is Owen. "What are you looking for?" Elijah asked, not accusing, just a hint of caution in his voice. Jasmine met his gaze, unapologetic. "I'm looking for the truth." "Feeling for what?" "Because you deserve your name back," she answered plainly, "and because if I turn away now, I don't deserve to speak of justice ever again." That night, after Tyler had fallen fast asleep, Jasmine told Elijah about her cousin, the one who had been among the officials who signed off on his disciplinary report years ago. "She didn't believe you were innocent," Jasmine said. "But she also never read the full file." She paused, then added quietly, I used to believe in the system, but now I see it picks its truths, and it doesn't spare those who stand alone. Elijah didn't respond for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was soft. I used to think if I just kept my head down and did the right thing, time would forgive me. Jasmine shook her head, her eyes sharp with clarity. No, Elijah, justice doesn't fix itself. It needs people to move it. In the days that followed, Jasmine started making calls, one after another. Lawyers, journalists, a private investigator she'd once worked with on a major charity case. She wasn't loud, but everything she did was deliberate, firm, and unrelenting, not just because Elijah had saved her, but because she knew she couldn't go on living in silence. Elijah stayed outside that orbit. He still treated townspeople, still taught Amara how to stitch fabric for practice. But every time he came through the door, he saw Jasmine hunched over documents, pausing only to jot down notes. Each ink mark, each scribbled line was part of a journey to reclaim what was right, not for the past, but for what came next. One night, Jasmine stayed up until morning on a call with a lawyer. Another day, she stood for hours in the snow to speak with one of Elijah's former colleagues, someone who had been in the OR that day. She had gone far beyond empathy. She was fighting for a truth once twisted until it vanished. One morning, Jasmine sat on the porch with printed emails, medical reports, and meeting notes spread out before her. Tyler played at her feet with a toy helicopter, and sometimes he'd look up and ask, "What are you doing, Mummy?" And Jasmine would gently brush his hair back, replying, "I'm fixing something grown-ups got wrong." Tyler didn't fully understand. Gordon says, but Elijah, watching quietly from inside, understood all too well. And then, one evening, as the house sat quiet except for the soft whisper of wind outside, Jasmine placed a thick folder on the table. "We found it," she said, her voice hoarse but sure. A nurse from back then admitted she was pressured into signing a false report. There's an audio recording, match statements, and an internal email that leaked. Everything points to the truth. You weren't wrong. They were. Elijah stared at the folder, then at Jasmine, the woman he had once carried through a storm, now returning to him not just his honor, but a part of his life he thought was gone forever. He slowly sat down, placing his hand gently on the cover, like he was afraid touching it might wake him from a dream that had just begun to mend itself. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. Jasmine gave a tired, steady smile. "Oh, Elijah, I needed to do this, not just for you, but for me." He'd say thank you. He just nodded, eyes reflecting not joy, but something deeper. Recognition. He was no longer alone. And sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you to stand up after a lifetime of falling. That night, Elijah pulled an old chest from under the bed, the one where he'd buried every award, every photo, every medical record from St. James. For the first time in years, he lifted out his framed medical degree and placed it on the table, right across from the folder Jasmine had left. The past and the present finally sat down together, and in that moment, Elijah knew justice doesn't come to those who wait. It comes to those who refuse to give up. The sky over Pine Hollow glowed that morning with the soft light of early spring. The snow was nearly gone, leaving muddy streaks and the first shy sprouts of grass peeking through. Inside Elijah's home, the hush of winter had been replaced by movement, soft footsteps, the quiet rustle of packing, like the overture to something just beginning. Jasmine wore a long charcoal coat, her hair pulled back neatly. She was headed back to the city, but this time she wasn't leaving with silent gratitude. She was carrying a mission. Before stepping into the car, she handed Elijah a thick envelope. "This has the formal petition, legal statements from involved parties, and the proposal for reinstating your medical license," she said. "I'll deliver it myself." Elijah took it, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you not just for this, but for believing me." Jasmine smiled, her expression softer than the one she wore when they first met. "Thank you for saving me." In every sense of the word, the car pulled away, carrying Jasmine back to the world she once knew. A world where power and media could build or break a man in a heartbeat. But this time, She wasn't returning to survive. She was returning to change it. Back in the city, Jasmine didn't sit quietly in some office. She held a press conference, hired a legal team that specialized in wrongful medical suspensions. She even convinced a major news network to reopen Elijah's case. The result was a 30-minute special report aired in prime time, and its impact was far greater than anyone had expected. Elijah Brooks' name was back in the headlines, this time not as a symbol of disgrace, but as the victim of a system that had once valued power over truth. Those who had turned their backs on him now stayed silent. Those who had always believed in him finally spoke up. Jasmine went everywhere, meeting former doctors from St. James, tracking down witnesses who had once been overlooked, and applying media pressure on the state medical board. She used her name, her influence, and her network, not to shield herself, but to put Elijah back where he belonged. There were nights she worked until dawn, her eyes red, hands buried in thick files marked with annotations. Alone in her apartment, she'd play a recording over and over of a nurse confessing she'd been coerced into lying. Jasmine listened to it like she was engraving the truth into her bones. One morning, the medical board called. They agreed to reopen Elijah's case. But the offer came with strings, conditions, bureaucratic delays that could stretch for weeks. Jasmine didn't back down. She knocked on doors, visited every office, faced those who had once dismissed Elijah. Every step she took pieced together a belief that had once been broken. Meanwhile, Elijah remained in Pine Hollow. He hadn't looked at the case file, hadn't asked about the progress. He kept treating the sick, a feverish child in the middle of the night, an elderly woman with a fractured hip, a young man injured on a job site. Every patient was a life story, and Elijah cared for them not out of obligation, but because this was what he was born to do. At night, when the town was quiet, he'd sit by the fire, listening to the wind whistle past the window. In his mind, the memory of that fateful surgery still returned. The smell of antiseptic, the blinding light of the operating room, the slowing heartbeat on the monitor, the judgmental stares that came after. He remembered it all, but for the first time in years it didn't feel like a stone on his chest. Because of Jasmine, one early summer afternoon, Jasmine came back to Pine Hollow. She didn't call ahead. Her SUV pulled up outside the old clinic. She stepped out in a simple dress, her eyes bright. In her hands, an envelope and a rolled-up blueprint. "Your license has been reinstated," she said, straight to the point. Officially, they admitted they were wrong. Elijah took the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't cry. He just sat quietly on the steps, fingers gently brushing his name at the top of the letter. Clean, unmarked, no asterisks, no strike-throughs. "And this," Jasmine said, unrolling the blueprint, "was the design for a new modern medical center. 5 exam rooms, a surgical suite, a community education wing, and a pharmaceutical storage area." Elijah looked at the blueprint, then at Jasmine. "You didn't just save me, you rebuilt me." A few months later, the center began construction. Dozens of volunteers showed up daily. Builders, students, farmers, everyone pitched in. People Elijah had treated brought bricks, paint, potted plants. The entire town came together. No one asked for anything in return. Elijah was there every day, sleeves rolled up, hands dirty with cement, eyes shining. On opening day, the town was empty outside because everyone was at the ribbon cutting. Some cried when they walked into the new exam rooms lit by bright white lights and equipped with clean, modern medical tools. An 80-year-old woman whispered, "We finally have a real doctor, one who stayed." That night, Jasmine and Elijah stood on the porch of his old home, gazing at the glowing health center in the middle of their little town. "This was never part of my life plan," Elijah said. "Sometimes," Jasmine replied. "The best plans are the ones we never saw coming." And in that moment, without love declarations or promises, both of them knew they were no longer just people swept away by fate. They were the ones who stayed, who rebuilt, and who stood by each other. Elijah Brooks' name had returned, but more importantly, it had left the pages of old headlines and found its place in the heartbeat of a town now stronger because of him. Some people spend their lives trying to leave a name carved into stone, but some, like Elijah Brooks, plant their names into the hearts of others. When summer reached Pine Hollow, the seeds he once planted in silence began to sprout, not just as a legacy of medicine, but as a rebirth of trust, a revival of kindness passed from one hand to another. Summer arrived in Pine Hollow with confident sunlight. The sky stretched wide and blue, the air fragrant with fresh-cut grass and warm earth after a night's rain. Down the dirt path leading to the Brooks Community Health Center, groups of children walked with purpose. Some wore volunteer T-shirts. A few clutched small first aid kits, eager to join a special class Elijah now hosted weekly. Inside the classroom, once a converted storage room, Elijah stood before a large whiteboard, holding a plastic heart model. His voice was steady. This is your heartbeat when you panic, and this is when you breathe, stay calm, and take control. You feel the difference? Little hands shot up, bright eyes sparkled. Tyler, the boy who once wandered through a blizzard to find help for his mother, was now the class assistant. He was excellent at teaching bandaging techniques, and always the last to leave the room, making sure every supply was put back just right. It wasn't just the kids. Adults were coming too. Mothers learning how to handle fevers. Fathers learning basic first aid. People who once feared doctors now came for blood pressure checks or just to be heard. Elijah met each of them with patience, not just treating illness, but restoring trust that had been worn down by years of abandonment. Tyler had grown close to Amara, Elijah's daughter. They were opposites, but fit together. Amara was sharp, full of questions. Tyler was quiet, steady, always ready to help. Together they organized the medical storage, kept volunteer journals, and began writing educational guides in plain language for the community. Elijah watched them both, and in his eyes was a light, the light of a new generation not just learning to leave, but learning to return and to make something better. Jasmine was there too, even with a full schedule back in the city. She chose to step back from the day-to-day operations of the center, but she was always supporting quietly in the background. She and her son visited most weekends, not as guests, but as family. Sometimes she brought friends, wealthy, powerful ones, so they could witness firsthand the transformation born not from budgets, but from compassion. They'd share dinner with Elijah and Amara beneath the old porch roof, passing around bowls of stew, freshly picked vegetables, and crisp cornbread. Nights like those always ended in laughter, sometimes with jazz humming softly from an old speaker, sometimes with retold stories that helped the children gathered around learn again about kindness and quiet resilience. One day, Elijah received a letter from his old medical school. They wanted him to return as a lecturer, even offering him an honorary title. He read the letter and left it on the table, unanswered, not out of bitterness, but because he knew he was exactly where he was needed most. Mara, seeing the silence in her father's eyes, said quietly, "You're still teaching, Dad. Your classroom just doesn't have a golden nameplate." But what moved him more than any letter came one afternoon when a group of young doctors from the city visited the health center. They didn't come to teach, they came to learn. They wanted to know how Elijah ran community classes, how he delivered high-quality care with limited resources, and above all, how to practice medicine without letting the real purpose get worn down by the grind. One young woman, fresh out of med school, took his hand and said, "We studied medicine hoping to become someone like you. I just didn't know where to start, but now I think I do." Elijah only smiled, not with pride, but with the quiet understanding of a man watching seeds take root. And he began to think bigger, about training local residents to become nurses, technicians, community health advocates. In the fall, Pine Hollow held its traditional harvest festival. That year, the townspeople proposed naming the small square outside the health center Opportunity Square, because right there they had seen life return. And during the festival, with bright flags fluttering and folk music filling the air, Jasmine handed Elijah a small notebook. Inside was a plan to establish a scholarship fund, named after Elijah's mother, for aspiring black medical students from rural areas. Elijah held it, quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "She always dreamed of this. I never thought I'd be the one to make it real for her." Jasmine looked at him and said, "You're not just doing it for your mom anymore. You're doing it for hundreds of other moms, and for the generations after them." At the same time, Amar and Tyler began organizing the town's first youth medical summer camp, where kids learned teamwork, first aid, and leadership skills. They pitched tents near the woods, brought along anatomy models and books, and turned learning into something alive. When Elijah dropped by unannounced, he found the kids laughing and wrapping each other in bandages during a mock competition, many of them hilariously wrong. Tyler spotted him and ran over. "Dr. Brooks, we're thinking of launching a podcast on community first aid. Can we interview you?" Elijah laughed heartily. "As long as you don't make me sound like I'm 100 years old." And when lanterns lit the sky later that night, floating upward into the dark like prayers, Elijah tilted his head back and watched. A quiet, overwhelming emotion rose in him. No one would ever know all he'd sacrificed. They didn't need to. What mattered was that what he'd given, his kindness, his knowledge, his quiet perseverance, had not disappeared into the void. It was living, spreading, shaping a different kind of future. Pine Hollow was no longer the forgotten town. It had become a testament that sometimes, from a single snowstorm, something miraculous begins to grow. And those seeds, they were blooming now in every heart that had learned how to love and never give up.